There was a young man named Daniel who had a list. Not a grocery list, not a reminder on his phone, but a handwritten list of everything he wanted to become before he turned 30. He wanted to start a business. He wanted to travel the world. He wanted to wake up one morning and feel proud of himself. The list had 16 items on it, and Daniel had been adding to it since he was 19 years old. But here's the part nobody talks about. The list had been sitting in the same drawer, untouched, for 6 years. Every time Daniel opened that drawer to get a pen or a charger, he would see it, feel something deep stir inside his chest, and quietly close the drawer again. He was 25 years old, working a job he never planned to stay in, living in a city that had started to feel like a trap, and carrying a dream so heavy that the weight of it had begun to make him completely still. This is the story of what happened when everything in Daniel's life finally broke open. Daniel grew up in a small town where ambition was treated like a personality flaw. You could be hardworking. You could be reliable. But you could not be too big for your shoes. That was the phrase the adults in his neighborhood liked to use. Too big for your shoes. His uncle had tried to start a clothing business in his 30s and was still being reminded of it at every family gathering 15 years later. His older sister had applied to study architecture at a university 3 cities away, and the family had sat around the table debating whether she was being sensible or irresponsible. Daniel had watched all of this quietly, and somewhere deep in his young mind, a belief had taken root. Wanting more was dangerous. Dreaming loudly was something you paid for. And so Daniel had become very good at something that would take him years to recognize as harmful. He had become the master of silent ambition. He wanted everything, told no one, and did nothing. And from the outside, the world called that laziness. What nobody understood about Daniel, including Daniel himself for a very long time, was that what looked like laziness was actually something else entirely. Researchers and psychologists who study human behavior have made a discovery that changes the way we should talk about people who seem stuck. Clinical psychologist Jenny Yip, in work covered by major health publications, explained that laziness and procrastination are not the same thing. Laziness, she said, is the absence of desire. Procrastination is the presence of too much feeling. It is not that the procrastinator does not care. It is that caring feels dangerous, and moving forward feels like walking toward a cliff. Daniel was not lazy. Daniel was terrified. He had watched ambition get punished his whole life, and his mind had quietly decided, without his permission, that keeping his dreams inside that drawer was the safest thing he could do. And so the years slipped by, one careful, uneventful day after another, and the list stayed folded in the dark. The moment that changed everything for Daniel did not come in the form of inspiration. It did not come as a sunrise epiphany or a motivational speech that shifted his perspective. It came on a Tuesday afternoon in the form of a very ordinary conversation that cracked something open inside him. He was sitting in the break room at work when a colleague named Marcus walked in and started talking. Marcus was not particularly successful by any conventional measure. He did not drive a nice car. He did not have an impressive title. But Marcus had this quality about him that Daniel had always noticed and never been able to name. Marcus talked about his plans the way most people talked about the weather. Casually. Like they were already real. That Tuesday, Marcus mentioned that he had started a small photography side business after work, booking one client at a time, making very little money but learning everything he could. And when Daniel asked him if he was not worried about failing, Marcus looked genuinely confused. He said, with no particular drama, that he had already failed 3 times this year alone. And then he shrugged and poured himself a coffee. Daniel drove home that evening thinking about that shrug. It was the most unbothered shrug he had ever seen in his life. Here was a man who had failed 3 times in less than 12 months, and he was talking about it with the same energy someone uses to describe a slightly delayed bus. Daniel kept turning it over in his mind. What was Marcus carrying that he was not? What had Marcus been given that allowed him to move through failure so lightly? And then it hit him, not as a thought, but as a physical sensation in the middle of his chest. Marcus was not carrying anything special. He was carrying less. Less fear of judgment. Less attachment to a perfect outcome. Less of the invisible weight that Daniel had been dragging around for 6 years disguised as patience and practicality. Daniel went home, opened the drawer, took out the list, and sat with it at the kitchen table for the first time. He did not make a plan that night. He did not do anything dramatic. He simply read it, all 16 items. And for the first time, he let himself feel the full force of how much he wanted those things. The next morning, Daniel did something that seemed ridiculously small but would turn out to be one of the most important decisions of his life. He picked one item from the list. Just one. Not the most impressive one. Not the one that would look best if he told someone about it. He picked the smallest, quietest item at the bottom of the page. He had written in slightly younger handwriting, "Learn how to cook 3 meals properly." And so that morning, before work, Daniel watched a 12-minute video about how to make a simple tomato sauce from scratch. That was it. No grand gesture. No announcement. Just 12 minutes and a pan of slightly burnt garlic that he ate anyway with enormous satisfaction. This tiny act might seem laughable compared to the scale of his dreams. But what Daniel was doing, without fully realizing it, was rewiring the relationship between himself and forward motion. He was teaching his nervous system that starting was survivable. That action did not have to be perfect to be real. There is a body of research on this exact phenomenon that gives it a name. Psychologists who study goal setting and motivation have found that extremely large, abstract goals tend to paralyze people rather than inspire them. When a goal feels unattainable, motivation does not just stall. It collapses. The brain registers the gap between where you are and where you want to be, and interprets that distance as a kind of threat. But small, concrete actions do something different. They create evidence. Every small win you accumulate becomes proof to your own mind that you are, in fact, someone who finishes things. Someone who starts things. And that proof, stacked carefully over time, becomes the foundation of a new identity.
Daniel did not know any of this at the time.
He was just cooking pasta and feeling slightly less terrible about himself. But in the invisible architecture of his psychology, something structural was shifting. The wall between who he was and who he wanted to be had developed its first crack. Over the following weeks, Daniel kept doing small things. He spent 20 minutes one evening researching how to register a business name. He watched a free online class on basic financial planning. He wrote a 2-paragraph description of the kind of business he had always wanted to start, a service that helped small local markets design better displays to attract more customers. It was not a fully formed business plan. It was not impressive. But it existed now in the physical world, in ink, on paper, and that mattered in ways Daniel was only beginning to understand. What he was also starting to notice, quietly and with some surprise, was how the people around him were responding to his energy. His younger brother called one evening and mentioned that Daniel sounded different lately. His mother, during a Sunday phone call, asked if something good had happened at work. Nothing had changed externally. The job was the same. The city was the same. The bank account was the same. But Daniel had changed in a way that other people could feel before he could fully explain it himself. The 4th week brought the first real test. Daniel had arranged to meet with the owner of a small grocery store on a Saturday morning to pitch the idea of redesigning the way the store displayed its seasonal produce. He had spent 3 evenings preparing a simple presentation on his laptop. He had rehearsed what he would say in the bathroom mirror. He had told no one, because the old fear of judgment still lived in him, quieter now but still present. When Saturday came, Daniel woke up 2 hours before the meeting and sat on the edge of his bed, paralyzed. The old voice in his head was back, clear and familiar. Who are you to walk in there? What makes you think this is a good idea? What happens when you get there and cannot answer a single question? He sat with that voice for a while. He did not try to silence it or argue with it. He had learned from Marcus to simply let it run its mouth, and then put on his shoes anyway. He put on his shoes. He drove to the store. And he walked through the door. The meeting lasted 45 minutes. The store owner, a quiet woman in her 60s named Mrs. Okonkwo, listened to everything Daniel said with her arms folded and her head slightly tilted. She asked several questions he was not fully prepared for. She pointed out 2 problems with his proposal that he had not considered. And then she told him to come back in 2 weeks with a revised version because she liked the core idea and wanted to see if he could think on his feet. Daniel walked out of that store and sat in his car for 10 full minutes. He had not been given a yes, but he had not been destroyed either. He had walked into something genuinely uncertain, and the world had not ended. This is a milestone that people who study personal development call the first courage loop. It is the moment when someone does a hard thing, survives it, and begins to update their belief about what they are capable of. Daniel did not have a word for it, but he could feel in his body that something was different now. The drawer felt further away. When Daniel returned to Mrs. Okonkwo's store 2 weeks later with a revised proposal, something unexpected happened. She approved it, offered him a small budget to work with, and told him that her son, who ran 2 other small shops nearby, had already heard about the meeting and wanted to have a conversation as well. Daniel had walked in hoping for 1 small client and left with the possibility of 3. This is the moment in most stories where the music swells and the narrator announces that everything changed overnight. But Daniel's story does not work that way, and that is part of what makes it worth telling. Because things did not change overnight. The first display he redesigned for Mrs. Okonkwo was not a masterpiece. One section was slightly crooked. The signage he printed was the wrong size. And he spent an entire afternoon fixing a lighting arrangement that he had not fully thought through before arriving. But customers noticed.
Not all of them.
Not dramatically. A few people paused longer at the display than they usually would. A few hands reached for things they had walked past 100 times before. And Mrs. Okonkwo smiled and said simply, "It is better." What was happening in Daniel's life during this period was a process that behavioral scientists describe as identity reconstruction. For most of his adult life, Daniel had thought of himself as someone with potential that had never been activated. That framing, potential without activation, is one of the most psychologically damaging positions a person can occupy because it keeps you permanently in the future tense. You are always about to become. You are always on the verge. But you are never actually anywhere. The small, imperfect work Daniel was doing was pulling him out of that future tense and into the present. He was not someone who might start a business one day. He was, right now, doing business. Imperfectly. Messily. With crooked signs and misprinted labels. But doing it. And the shift from might to am is not a small thing. It is the shift that determines everything. It is the difference between a life spent in the drawer and a life spent in the world. There is a line of thinking in psychology that says we do not think our way into new actions. We act our way into new thinking. For years, Daniel had been trying to feel ready before he started. He had been waiting for the fear to leave, for the confidence to arrive, for the conditions to be perfect. But confidence is not a prerequisite for action. It is a byproduct of action. It is built, not granted. Every morning that Daniel got up and did one small thing, he was not expressing confidence. He was manufacturing it. One tiny deposit at a time into an account that had been empty for years. The fear did not go away. He still sometimes woke up at 3 in the morning with his mind running through everything that could go wrong. But his relationship with that fear was transforming. It had gone from a stop sign to a companion. Something that traveled alongside him without being able to hold him back. And that distinction between fear as a wall and fear as a shadow is the difference between a life unlived and a life fully engaged. By the time Daniel's business had its first 3 paying clients, he had gone back and looked at the list. Not to mark things off dramatically, though he did allow himself a small private moment of satisfaction, but to read it again with new eyes. Some of the items on the list were exactly what he still wanted. Others, he noticed, had been written by a younger version of himself who had been trying to impress a world that was not watching. He had written that he wanted to be featured in a magazine. Looking at that now, he could see it for what it was. Not a genuine desire, but a hunger for proof. Proof that he was enough. Proof that his ambition had been worth it. And the beautiful, quietly devastating realization that settled over him as he sat at that kitchen table was that he no longer needed the magazine. The proof was already in his hands. It was in the crooked signs and the early mornings and the 45 minutes with Mrs. Okonkwo and the shrug that Marcus had given him over a cup of coffee a year ago. The story of Daniel is not the story of a man who became spectacularly wealthy or famous. It is the story of something rarer and more valuable. It is the story of a man who closed the gap between who he was and who he had always known he could be. And that gap, invisible to everyone else but felt every single day by the person living with it, is the gap that quietly drains the joy out of intelligent, capable, deeply feeling people all over the world. The researchers are right when they say that procrastination is not laziness. It is usually the result of fear dressed in comfortable clothing. Fear of failure. Fear of judgment. Fear of succeeding and then being expected to maintain it. Fear of finding out that maybe the dream, once lived, is smaller than the dream once imagined. But here is what Daniel learned, and what the evidence consistently shows, that fear does not have to be defeated before you start. You just have to learn to move with it, standing right next to you. There is something important to understand about the people in our lives who seem lazy, who seem stuck, who seem to have potential that they refuse to use. In most cases, and the science supports this, they are not refusing. They are afraid. They are overwhelmed. They are surrounded by an environment that made ambition feel like a punishable offense at some point in their history. And what they need is not criticism. They do not need someone to shake them and remind them of their wasted potential. They need the equivalent of Marcus and his shrug. They need someone who demonstrates, through the casual evidence of their own life, that failure is just weather. That it is something that happens to you on the way to somewhere, not something that defines the final destination. The most powerful thing you can do for a stuck person is not offer them a solution. It is let them watch you be imperfect without apology. There is another piece of Daniel's story that almost never gets told because it does not fit the clean narrative of the self-made transformation. About 8 months into his new work, Daniel had the worst month of his entire life. He lost 2 clients in the same week because of a miscommunication about pricing that he had handled badly. He made a financial mistake that cost him more than he had earned in the previous 6 weeks. He lay on his couch for 3 days and did not answer messages. The drawer, metaphorically, beckoned. It whispered that this was what always happened, that it was better to want nothing, risk nothing, and protect yourself from exactly this feeling. But something had changed in Daniel that the couch could not quite reach. He had built enough evidence of himself by then. He had enough small wins stacked up in his memory to know that the person lying on that couch was not the full story. He gave himself 3 days. And then on the 4th day, he got up and called one of the clients he had lost and asked for an honest conversation about what had gone wrong. That call lasted an hour. The client came back. What that terrible month taught Daniel was the lesson that no motivational speech can fully prepare you for.
And it is this.
The goal is not to become someone who never falls. The goal is to become someone who falls and already knows in their bones that they are getting back up. That knowing is not something you can borrow from someone else. You cannot read it in a book and own it. You cannot watch someone else demonstrate it and have it transferred to you. You have to earn it through your own small, stubborn, imperfect attempts at living. And once you have earned it, once you have proven to yourself through lived experience that you are the kind of person who gets back up, no one can take that from you. Not a bad month. Not a lost client. Not a family gathering full of people who remember your uncle's failed clothing business. The foundation, once built through real action, holds. Daniel is 31 years old now. He has 6 clients. He employs 2 people part-time.
He is not wealthy.
He does not live the way he once imagined he would when he was 19 and writing a list by lamplight. But there is something in his eyes when he talks about his work that is very difficult to describe and impossible to fake. It is the look of someone who closed the drawer. Not because the dreams inside it became smaller, but because the person standing in front of the drawer became larger. He still gets afraid. He still has mornings where the voice from the old neighborhood visits and asks him who he thinks he is. But the list is no longer in the drawer. It is taped to the wall above his desk, visible every single day, because lists were never meant to be hidden. They were always meant to be lived. And here is the question that this story leaves us with, the question that is worth sitting with for longer than is comfortable. What is in your drawer? Not the metaphorical drawer belonging to some distant version of you from years ago, but the one you opened this morning and quietly closed. The goal you have been giving perfect conditions to, waiting for the right time, the right resources, the right version of yourself to arrive. What if that version never arrives the way you are imagining it? What if the right version of you is the one who picks up the pen with a shaking hand and starts anyway? Daniel was not special. He was not unusually brave or unusually talented. He was someone who was tired enough of the drawer to finally try the world instead. And the world, imperfect and uncertain and sometimes deeply unkind as it is, turned out to be exactly where his life had been waiting for him all along. Open the drawer. Read the list. Put on your shoes. The rest is just one small day after another.